seen it by now. Tens of thousands of people sitting shoulder to shoulder, arms pulling back in perfect unison, a drum beating faster and faster, and one word echoing through the stadium: row. The Norwegian Viking Row has become one of the defining images of the 2026 FIFA World Cup, seen in stadiums, on escalators, in Times Square, and in the Norwegian Parliament. It's taken the tournament by storm the way Iceland's thunderclap took over Euro 2016. And everyone watching it thinks they know what it represents: warriors, power, some vague sense of Norse toughness. But the real history of how Vikings actually rowed and sailed their longships is so much stranger, so much more brutal, and so much more sophisticated than the chant gives them credit for. Most people have no idea how any of it actually worked, and one fact near the end of this, about what was legally required every single time a Viking picked up an oar, is going to change how you see the whole thing. This video is about the real mechanics, the forgotten rituals, and the flat-out shocking engineering behind Viking longships. And I want to be clear up front. This isn't a myths debunked video. The Vikings were exactly as hard as you think they were. The truth just makes them harder. Let's start with the ship itself, because before you can understand how they rowed, you have to understand what they were rowing inside. And it was unlike anything else on the water at the time. Every other naval power in medieval Europe built ships designed to resist the ocean. Thick hulls, rigid frames, brute force against the waves. The Vikings did the opposite. When a longship hit a massive ocean swell, the entire hull didn't fight it. It bent. It twisted. It flexed with the contour of the wave like a living thing. Crew members on modern replica voyages have described feeling the whole hull writhe beneath them in heavy seas. Not breaking, just yielding. That wasn't a flaw in the design. That was the design. The overlapping plank construction, called clinker-built, was specifically what allowed the ship to move that way. And it's the reason Viking longships could survive open Atlantic crossings that would have destroyed anything else floating in the 9th century. And the planks themselves were sealed with a method that sounds almost improvised, but was actually brilliant. Vikings stuffed the gaps between the hull planks with wool, moss, or animal hair, whatever organic material was available, which acted like a sponge, then coated the whole thing with tar or animal tallow to lock it watertight. The ship was essentially caulked with the natural world around it. The downside was that this material dried out constantly and had to be repacked regularly, which meant ship maintenance wasn't something you did before a voyage. It was something you did continuously, every single time the ship was in use. Now here's where it gets militarily interesting. And this is the fact that most people completely miss when they think about why the Vikings were so dominant. The number that makes it real is this. Even a massive 100-foot warship carrying dozens of fully armored warriors drew only about 3 feet of water. 3 feet. For context, most naval vessels of the period needed a proper harbor. Deep water, a dock, infrastructure. The longship needed a beach. That shallow draft is what made the Vikings militarily unstoppable in a way no other force could replicate. You couldn't defend against them the way you'd defend against a normal navy because they didn't need to come from the sea. They could come from the river, they could come from the marsh. They could come from the creek behind your village that you never thought twice about. And they built these ships from materials that took decades to find. For a typical 20-meter longship, shipwrights needed roughly 11 oak trees, each one a meter wide and 5 meters long, plus a single 18-meter trunk for the keel alone. Oaks of that size and quality would be nearly impossible to find in Europe today. The trees the Vikings needed to build these ships essentially no longer exist. Viking Age forests were ancient in a way modern forests simply aren't, and the shipwrights who worked them didn't just pick the biggest tree available. They walked the forest looking for trees that had already grown into specific natural shapes, because they used the natural curves of trunks, branches, and roots to form the curved structural components of the hull. A straight tree couldn't give you what you needed. You needed a tree that had already done half the work for you. Building a longship wasn't construction, it was more like sculpture. Finding the shape that was already there and releasing it. Now, the rowing. because this is where the Viking Row chant gets interesting and where the real history goes somewhere nobody expects. The chant is mimicking something real. Before a raid, before a battle on the water, the sail came down and the oars came out. That transition from wind power to muscle power was the signal. It meant they were close. It meant it was about to happen. So when you watch 50,000 people do that in a football stadium, they are, without knowing it, performing the exact ritual that preceded Viking violence for 300 years. But here's what the chant doesn't capture: how brutally hard that rowing actually was, and how precisely it was organized. Modern replica testing found that with a full crew of 24 at the oars, a Viking longship replica could hit around 4 knots at a sprint, but only for about 15 minutes. That's when the crew collapsed from exhaustion. For anything longer than that, 2 to 3 knots was the realistic ceiling. So the Vikings weren't rowing fast for long stretches. They were rowing in coordinated shifts, conserving energy across hours and days, managing their bodies the way a marathon runner manages pace. And those shifts weren't informal. They were written into law. This is the fact I promised you at the start, and it's the one that stopped me cold when I first came across it. The term was vika sjovar, and it referred to the distance a man was expected to row before being relieved. That distance was set at exactly 1,000 strokes, about 2 hours of work. And this wasn't a tradition or a custom. It was codified, written into Norse law. 1 sea mile was literally defined as the distance a crew could cover in 1 rowing shift, 1,000 strokes per man. Viking rowing wasn't just a physical act. It was a legal and navigational system. The oar stroke was the unit of measurement. The man's body was the instrument, and the law told you exactly when his shift was over. Think about what that means for a moment. These weren't just warriors. They were operating a precision system. Shifts, distances, legal obligations, coordinated endurance, in open ocean, in conditions that modern trained athletes have described as nearly overwhelming. Which brings us to the Sea Stallion. In 2007, the largest Viking ship replica ever built, a 30-meter reconstruction, sailed the original route from Roskilde in Denmark all the way to Dublin. The crew were modern trained athletes. They had prepared extensively, and the physical demands of the crossing were still nearly overwhelming. The rowing required excellent conditioning, and poorly coordinated rowing could actually be dangerous. One person out of rhythm could disrupt the whole stroke sequence and put stress on the hull at the wrong moment. The crossing took weeks. The Vikings who originally made that journey weren't just warriors. They were endurance athletes operating precision machinery in open ocean for months at a time. And they did it with a crew that included, and this one still gets me, a barber surgeon and a professional bard. Both considered essential. According to the Norwegian gelading law from the 1100s, the required crew of a longship included the skipper, the steersman, the cook, weapons handlers, ordinary crew, and a dedicated medical officer and a professional storyteller. The bard's job was to maintain morale on long voyages. Entertainment was considered as essential as surgery. These ships weren't just weapons, they were self-contained communities with legal structures, medical care, and someone whose entire job was to keep the crew's spirits up across months at sea. And every time anyone anywhere uses the word starboard, they are using a word those crew members invented. Longships didn't have a central rudder. They used a large wing-shaped steering oar fixed permanently to the right-hand side of the stern. That side of the ship became known in Old Norse as styribord, the steering board side, which became starboard, a word used in every navy on every ship, in every ocean on Earth today. The name for that side of the ship outlasted the civilization that invented it by 1,000 years. So here's what we actually know. The Viking Row you've been watching at this World Cup is more accurate than most people realize. The synchronized movement, the drum, the rowing before battle, all of it traces back to something real. But the real thing was a legal system built around 1,000 stroke shifts. It was a ship that flexed in the waves instead of fighting them. It was a hull sealed with moss and wool, built from trees that no longer exist, carrying a surgeon and a storyteller alongside the warriors. It was a vessel that drew 3 feet of water and could therefore go anywhere. Rivers, beaches, marshes, places no enemy thought to defend. And it was operated by men who, when modern athletes tried to replicate their journeys, nearly broke. That chant you've been watching is 1,000 years old. The people doing it in the stands just don't know how deep it actually goes. If this kind of thing is your thing, where a viral moment turns out to have a stranger history underneath it than anyone expected, hit subscribe, because that's exactly what this channel does. And if you want to keep going right now, there's a video next that goes into the actual Viking raids themselves, how they planned them, how fast they moved on land once they beached, and why coastal monasteries had essentially no chance. It's right there. I'll see you in it.